Welcome to Internally Guided Life, a podcast to help you unlock a life of balance, fulfillment, and joy. I'm Kayla Sweet, and together we're going to have fun and create change from the inside out. I'm so glad you're here. Welcome back, my friends. We are in for a treat today. We are going to be talking about something that impacts all of us in some way or another throughout the course of our lives and can be really challenging to navigate and come through. And this topic is toxic relationships. What do they look like? How do we know we're there? How do we disentangle ourselves from these? And how do we return to ourselves afterwards? And to help us explore this incredibly important and very common topic, this thing that so many of us have deeply impacting our lives, whether that's at work or at home or in our intimate relationships. We have a specialist here with us today, Sara McCready. She mentors high achieving and intuitive women to rise up, reclaim, and reconnect with their energy and the parts of themselves they've left behind. She is a certified Reiki Master Teacher. She is an intuitive mentor. She is a meditation guide. She's doing amazing things in the world for women to help them build their confidence, feel powerful, and to really become unstoppable through mind, body, and soul. So she does this through her one-to-one mentorship programs. And the reason she is such an expert in this is that she has walked this path herself. She knows the terrain. She has an incredible story. And I am so incredibly excited to have her joining us today. So with that, welcome, Sara. We are so excited to have you
Oh,
here.
hello, Kayla. Oh my goodness. I am so humbled and so honored by that introduction. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for coming on the show. I think we're going to have just an amazing exploration today, and I'm personally very excited about it. So, can you take a minute and just tell everybody a little bit about who you are and what you do beyond the brief bio?
Yeah. So my whole reason for being at this stage and phase of my life is because, as you shared, I've walked this path. And I have experienced 4 separate toxic relationships over a 25-year period of my life. One of those relationships was a marriage. And it was through the recovery, emotional recovery, and healing journey of the 4th and final toxic relationship that I came into the awareness that there wasn't the support or the understanding of what it means to heal emotionally, mentally, and physically from a toxic relationship. So, as you shared, I mentor women now. I have created 2 programs that work with women exclusively from the toxic relationship perspective. So helping them to move past the trauma, the drama, and the chaos that they had experienced in those relationships and moving into that peace, ease, clarity, and joy. If you've ever experienced a toxic relationship, whether it's at work or at home with family, friends, or in an intimate and romantic relationship, you know that there is never really that sense of closure. And until you do the deep dive within and begin to heal your mind, body, and soul, there is this wound, we'll call it, that leaves a mark, and you are unable to have a full and complete relationship in the most healthy way until you have identified what these cycles of behaviors are. And so, because there was that 25-year period, it took me those 4 separate relationships to really figure out what that pattern was and to start to move inward and heal fully and completely. that is what became my reason for being. It was divinely led, divinely guided. There's no other explanation for how this all occurred and why I'm doing what I'm doing today. But that's a really kind of long-winded explanation of what I do and how I'm doing it now. And it is because I've walked this path and I know it intimately.
I just am so inspired by the way that you've taken your personal experience and the patterns that you were trapped in yourself for all of these years and that you saw repeating, and the way that that finally kind of clicked into place and you were able to wrap your awareness around that and identify what this looks like for people experientially, how you can identify it and how you could start to break those patterns. This is so needed because some people, I mean, when we get into these, we don't realize we're in them. When we're in them, we just might know something's wrong, but it can go on, and you can continue to perpetuate these patterns of unhealth and lack of harmony in your life, and it's just so incredibly painful. So this work that you're doing is so important. And one of the things I was most inspired by and was excited to have you on to talk about is just a little bit more about your story. You gave us the kind of brief overview, but were there any key points, and what did that look like for you when it came to starting to unravel these wounds and these patterns on your own journey?
Yeah, there were definitely key points. That's why I describe it as the fourth and final toxic
Mhm.
relationship. There had been in the previous three, there was always, it was me pointing my finger at them
Mm,
because there was addiction involved with each of them. And so it was really easy for me to say, well, it didn't work out because they have addiction issues. And it was really easy for me to put the blame fully and completely on them. And it was really easy for me to not have any accountability because, well, I was an innocent bystander in all of this. And it was through the emotional recovery journey with that fourth and final toxic relationship that I recognized that I was the common denominator in
mm,
each of those relationships. And it was the day that I recognized that I was the common denominator that I began to unpack, which is to say, when we talk about unpacking an experience, what we're really saying is we're doing the deep dive on the emotional experience and the mental experience that has occurred in those relationships. And so I began to process the emotions for each one of those four relationships. And it was starting to understand when I could zoom out and look at the whole picture instead of pointing the finger at the other person continually. It was when I was able to zoom out and look at the whole picture, I was able to identify what those patterns of behavior were that I was being attracted to, and what was it in me
mm,
that was continuing to be led into those relationships. And then it was also recognizing that it wasn't just the four intimate relationships that I had, it was at home, at work. These toxic relationship cycles had been occurring everywhere for my whole life. And so when I began to really identify what that was, that is when the healing portion began.
mm,
Literally feeling it to heal it, as I call it, processing the experience emotionally, processing the trauma in each of those relationships. When you're inside a toxic relationship, whether it's at work or with parents or siblings or intimate and romantic, there is trauma that's incurred in those relationships. And when I'm talking about trauma, I'm talking about what I call little t trauma. So it's like a repeated experience over and over again over a long period of time. And so for me, I was able to identify what that looked like, what my response was to those situations. So the more that someone was not treating me respectfully, not being in the relationship in a reciprocal fashion. So there wasn't a fair exchange of time or energy or uh, emotions, feelings, love, any of it. It was identifying that that is when I would double down and try even harder. And
Mm.
so starting to see what my own patterns were in response to the toxic behavior.
Wow. I feel like you just touched on so many key things that are so incredibly hard to do, especially that piece of like realizing that you are the common denominator. Because when we're in these situations and we're in this toxicity, it is very easy to point the blame elsewhere. And of course, nobody ever deserves mistreatment. And this is, I think, when we've been hurt, we've maybe been abused emotionally or physically, it's not about taking blame or shame around it, but owning what wounds we have that are putting us in these situations and causing us to stay tethered to them and stay wrapped up in them and continue to repeat them. Yeah, and it's hard. It's hard to do that inner reflection and that work to really unravel all of that.
Yeah. It's I never wanted to be bitter. One of the driving forces from that fourth and final toxic relationship was that because of my age at that point, I was 49, and I did not want to live the rest of my life being bitter from that experience.
Mm.
And so it was through that awareness that I was being guided to explore what was really going on here. And that is not to, you kind of touched on this, that is not to dismiss the abusive behavior. There was mental and emotional abuse in each one of those relationships. And taking responsibility for your part does not dismiss the abuse that you may have experienced in a toxic relationship. However, what it does do is it gives you license to heal those parts of yourself that are still participating in those patterns or cycles of behavior. Because at the end of the day, that behavior can't continue in your life if you don't allow it. And there was a part of me that was allowing that behavior to continue. So I had, after each of those relationships, I had done healing work. There had been emotional processing. I would spend 2 or 3, sometimes 4 years being single in between each of those relationships and really processing my emotions and starting to understand about codependency and what that looks like and how it shows up and how I was relating
Mm.
in relationship as a codependent. But what really didn't click in until that fourth and final toxic relationship and emotional recovery journey was understanding what the codependent patterns are in me and how they show up inside of a relationship. So I knew it cognitively and I kind of knew it on the surface. And I would say that in my early days, like the first 3 relationships, I was very dismissive of the codependent programming.
Mm.
Again, it's not me. I don't have a problem. Everyone else has the problem. And it was on the emotional recovery journey with that fourth and final relationship that I was able to fully see how those patterns of behavior were driving my responses and my reactions to people that are less than kind and not always with the best intentions. So having like a full awareness of who you are and what your patterns and triggers are is really when you begin to take full control back of how your relationships show up for you.
What's landing for me as I'm listening to this is when you take that ownership and you do that hard work and that self-reflection, that awareness, you're then able to gift the rest of your life more health, more healing, relationships that aren't perpetuating these patterns. So even though there is a challenge maybe in bringing this awareness and taking that ownership and really doing this work, because it's not easy work to do, but the
Mm-hmm.
rest of your life is better for it. So it's worth that investment.
100%. And as I was saying, I did not want to be bitter, and I did not want to spend the next 50 years being entangled in the same style of relationship over and over again. And I would say another driving factor was for me doing the work that I'm doing today, working with clients, is because there was so little information out there, even though, as you and I have spoken before, this was not that long ago. This was only 5 years ago that I exited out of the fourth and final relationship. And even at that time, as recent as 5 years ago, there wasn't the information available to me or the understanding of what it was that I had gone through.
Mm.
And so, because my family was supportive to the extent that they could be, they were sad that this had occurred, but they didn't understand the depths of what happened emotionally. No one really knows what emotional abuse is until you've experienced it. And because you look fine on the outside, there's no connection unless you've experienced emotional abuse to what is occurring for you on the inside and why you're not functioning the same way that you did before. And
Mm.
so, the drive to heal myself mentally, emotionally, physically, on all levels, and to break the cycles for good and share this information. Once I figured out how this all fit together, it was like I had to share it with the world. I couldn't not talk about this. And I believe there's a reason why I experienced 4 separate toxic relationships over a 25-year period. There's
Mm.
no better training ground than lived learning.
Yes. Well, and so many of the most profound healers and wisdom keepers that I have come in contact with are the people who've personally experienced it. I think we all, when we've had these hurdles and we've done this healing and we've seen a particular path unfold in ourselves, we are so much more acquainted to be able to support people. When you haven't walked it, it's very hard to relate and understand and support people well, as long as we've done that work ourselves. If we've been there, there's just a deeper layer of connection that happens. And I think those of us who are called to do that work with others afterwards, you're right, it is for a reason. It is that divine calling, that intervention, that you learned these specific lessons for a reason. And this is part of your gift to bring to the world and help with the healing moving forward.
I agree 100%. It wasn't all for naught.
Yeah.
And there was a time, I'm not going to lie, in the, early days where I really did wonder what had happened to my life, what had happened to me, because it all had imploded and exploded so monumentally that you can't see the forest for the trees in the early days when you're in the thick of it. But as the fog cleared and as the healing began to deepen and the wisdom started to come in, that's when I was like, oh, that's what it's all for. This
Yes.
is meant to be shared.
Yes. I love that. Okay, so I want to shift gears just a little bit, just getting into more of the nuance. So we've been talking about toxic relationships, but we haven't really defined this yet. How do you define a toxic relationship? I know you've mentioned these were everywhere in your life. They were intimate relationships, they
Mm-hmm.
were at work. What does this mean to you? How do you define a toxic relationship, and how might someone know that they're in that? What does it look like?
So for me, a toxic relationship is a repeated pattern of behaviors that you're experiencing from another that are harmful to your emotional and mental health. And it's not just physical abuse. A toxic relationship goes so much deeper than just physical abuse. It's this mental and emotional abuse that I keep referencing. And the key piece that I was able to understand and that I share with my clients now is that when words and actions are not aligning, it doesn't mean they didn't hear you. It means that they are not intending to do the work or be in a reciprocal relationship or have a healthy relationship. Because if there was the intention to be in a true partnership, then there would be concessions made on both sides.
Mm,
And one of the things that I recognized while I was doing my healing work and piecing this all together was that the more that someone would say, and this is a romantic relationship in particular I'm referencing right now, the more someone would say, yeah, we're together, we're a couple, we're in this to win it, we're going to do this together. And the less that their actions would demonstrate that,
mm,
the louder I would get. So rather than having an awareness that their actions didn't match their words, they were saying we were a couple, and yet they were out 5 nights a week and never contacting me.
mm,
So the more that the actions didn't align with the words, I kept focusing on the words. I
mm,
wasn't seeing the actions. And so that is when I would double down. We need to talk about this. We need to fix this. We need to, what can I do? And of course, then we turn it inward on ourselves as if we are doing something wrong. And so then we try harder and harder and harder. So this is what I call turning myself into the human pretzel. I would
mhm,
do handstands and cartwheels and turn myself inside and out to get their attention, to get that what I thought was conversation to be had to resolve the situation. What I never understood was when someone's words and actions don't align, it is intentional. That is the message. You need to watch their actions, not listen to their words.
mm,
So that's like the biggest thing to begin to look for in a toxic relationship, but as a toxic relationship pattern. That is my definition of what a toxic relationship is when words and actions don't align repeatedly and there are repeated patterns of behavior. How this shows up at work is I've had experiences where I was told that I would be getting a promotion or that, something would be happening within my team or my group because of the work that I did. And then nothing would materialize.
Mm.
So rather than understanding that I had been misled, I would interpret that as, oh, I have to try harder. I have to do more. So then how that benefits the company is they're getting more work and more effort and more output for the same amount of salary.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, and then with friends, it's friends and family, it's similar to the intimate and romantic relationship. If it's not reciprocal, if there is not a fair exchange of time and energy, if it is one sided where you're doing all the giving, you're making all the plans, you're putting in all the effort, then that is not a healthy relationship.
What I love about your definition and your explanation of these is how tangible it is, how easy it would be to do an evaluation, a self-evaluation, to just take a look and see where are the behaviors not aligning with the words? Because those are things that we can really clearly pull. And I think many of us who have experienced maybe prior trauma, or just those of us who are conditioned as women, or who have some of these wounds, the reflex is to look at, what are we doing wrong? How can we do it better? How can we fix it? How can we have a better conversation? Maybe we're not, communicating well enough, or working hard enough, or showing that we love this person enough. We do all of these things, and we aren't always evaluating the facts of the situation. This is what they said, this is what they did, over and over and over. So this is something that's really concrete, that I think will be easy for everyone listening to be able to just take a moment and evaluate, are there spaces in life where this is happening, and how are you responding to it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Internalizing the outcomes. So, meaning, as you were just describing, like doing more, trying harder. How can we have a better conversation? Maybe I need to figure out my communication skills. Those, when you catch yourself turning yourself into the human pretzel, that is an indicator that there isn't reciprocity or a fair exchange. And so rather than internalizing, oh, I must be doing something wrong, it's time to start asking yourself, and I'm going to pause here because I've actually never articulated this before. So I'm going to take 1 second. It's like, what else do I need to know about this situation?
Mm.
Rather than focusing on yourself as if you are doing something wrong, you can ask yourself, what else do I need to know about this situation or this experience?
Wow. There's so much wisdom in that simple sentence. Like, just to be able to disconnect and disentangle for a moment could provide so much clarity and reduce a lot of the internal turmoil, right, that we go through when we're trying to navigate these situations, and we're putting all of that blame onto ourselves, really looking at it, almost as a relational scientist, right? Like, what's the
Mm-hmm.
whole picture? What else is going on that I need to learn about?
Yeah. And it allows you to take that, like open up the lens on your camera and
Mm.
allows you to take that bigger perspective view. What happens so often inside of a toxic relationship, again, whether this is at work, with your immediate family, or a partner or spouse, what happens so often is we get into that micro view. We cannot see the forest for the trees.
Mhm.
And so we don't have a whole picture perspective. And then again, tying back into what we were just saying, we are also internalizing so much as if we are the ones doing something wrong. And so, in order to stop blaming yourself, even for a second, just giving yourself that chance to open up the lens. What else do I need to know about this experience? Because then you're not You're not blaming them. You're not blaming yourself. It's a
Mhm.
gentle way of beginning that self exploration.
Yes, I think that's so important too, that you're also not putting the blame on the other person when you're asking this question. That's a really key point because I think it is easy once you maybe do start to notice some of that to immediately focus it only on the outside person and blame them or project that anger and that frustration, and then you might be able to end that situation, but then you end up back in another situation. Then you're like, why does this keep happening to me? So to be able to get all of the information from more of an objective place of what all is really going on with me,
Mm.
with them, with the situation, I love that approach.
Yeah. Yeah. And as codependents, and quite often, if you find you are in a toxic relationship, most often there is codependent programming and patterns and conditioning that are running subconsciously and consciously, how you are responding and reacting and showing up. And so, as a codependent, it's so challenging to be able to be objective about anything because you're either swinging one way or the other. You're either swinging into that self blame and shame, or you're swinging way the other way. And like I said, pointing the finger at the other person. And so this allows a little bit of neutrality so that you can open up the lens to see what else might be happening here and then beginning to investigate from there.
Yeah, it really gives you that chance to step out of a reactive mode and try to evaluate and respond. Okay, so we start to see these signs. Let's say someone is noticing these misalignments between words and actions. They're starting to recognize the lack of reciprocity in the relationship, and they're seeing these warning signs, these indicators. What does the process of actually disentangling from these relationships look like, both emotionally and physically in the material world, as far as maybe it means leaving a situation, ending a relationship? How does one start that internal and external process?
Mm. It is such an individual experience, and each relationship is such an individual experience as well. There is no prescription per se, but what I would suggest is that you give yourself some space. When we are inside of a toxic relationship, and this is specific to intimate and romantic relationships, as well as parental or siblings. When we're inside of a toxic relationship, there is so much gaslighting or brainwashing that occurs that you're not able to see up or down, left or right, back or forth. It is foggy. And that is a byproduct of being inside of those relationships. They are intended to keep you in a fog so that you can't see the truth of a situation. So, one of the key elements to beginning to disentangle is giving yourself some space and finding, if you're able to, if it is an option for you, removing yourself completely for a period of time will allow you to begin to come back into your body. You'll be able to start regulating your nervous system because you're not always going to be in the trauma, the drama, and the chaos.
Mm.
One of the key elements of a toxic relationship is there's always drama, there is always chaos. I guess that would be another identifier. If you find like every other day there's something happening, oh my God, can you believe this happened now? If you find that you're saying that all the time, that's also a key indicator that it is not an emotionally healthy relationship.
Mm.
So, getting back to how to disentangle, you have to give yourself space. If you have the option of going no contact, um, getting your own space or place to live in, um, whatever that can look like for you, it may mean carving out space in a house if you're living together where you are kind of sequestering yourself, if you will. But the key component is to begin to allow that fog to lift. And the only way the fog can lift is if you get some space. And when we begin to give ourselves that space, and that's, a few months of space, not just a few days,
Right.
because you didn't get into the situation that you're in overnight. And so it doesn't unwind itself overnight. But if you're able to really give yourself some space, either moving into your own place or moving somewhere else that's safe for you, then you can begin to start regulating your nervous system and start piecing together the experience that you had. Because when the fog lifts, that is when you're able to see a bigger picture and begin to understand that there was more at play than what you were perceiving while you were in the relationship.
That's such a practical, I think, piece of advice. This is something I'm really appreciating from our conversation, as I think there are so many little and big things that people can practically apply if this is resonating with them. So I thank you for that. I love how grounded your approach is, even with the depths that you've gone to, both, relationally and spiritually and energetically, that these are really grounded practices, just the act of space to allow for clarity to arise so that people can start to see themselves again, because you get so lost when you're constantly entangled in these interactions.
That is a hallmark of not only codependency, but emotionally unhealthy relationships or highly toxic relationships. The mental and emotional abuse is intended to keep you in a reactive state so that you are not ever able to fully be, number one, in your body, and number two, be present in the moment.
Mm.
That is part of the abusive cycle or the trauma cycle, is to keep you stuck in that loop where you're always reacting and never responding, where you're always out of your body and never present, where you're always questioning yourself and not the other person.
So you've mentioned a couple of times throughout these codependent, like programming, these patterns, the ways that these toxic relationships and codependent relationships show up across time. Could you speak a little bit to really how these begin to develop and how they repeat across the lifespan, how we have this programming and these tendencies where those initial, I guess, wounds are,
Mm,
so that people
yeah,
could start to maybe reflect, retrospectively and think about that?
yeah. So, societally, in addition to your family of origin or your primary caregiver, whether that was a parent or a relative or whoever the primary caregiver was for you, there is, in a codependent dynamic, or as you were saying, the initial wound, there is a relationship dynamic that is unconsciously and unintentionally created that keeps you in a place of people pleasing,
Mm.
overgiving, over accommodating, having low or no boundaries, and essentially creates what that creates in you is the learning or understanding that in order to receive love and validation, you must perform by overgiving, people pleasing, and doing everything for somebody else before you do it for yourself.
Mm.
So it is a conditioning that is set up whereby your cues for receiving love are given to you or created within you by serving others at the expense of yourself. And when I say at the expense of yourself, I'm talking mentally, emotionally, and physically, and sometimes financially.
This is so it's so interesting because a lot of these things that you've brought up, the perfectionism, the people pleasing, the self sacrifice, constantly trying to prove worth and earn love. All of these things are the same things that come up with my clients. I work really around workplace burnout and the
Mm-hmm.
stress of that. And I think it's the same wound. It's the same pattern we're
Yeah.
talking about, right? Because it's that that initial um, that initial wounding that creates the sense of I have to do X to belong, to be loved, to be valued. And so when you do this work, it shows up everywhere. It's going to make work better and healthier. It's going to make your relationships better and healthier. So I was just admiring some of these overlaps with the work that I do, even though we work
Yeah,
in, somewhat different areas, it's all connected and on these healing journeys.
it absolutely is. And one of the biggest ahas I had, probably almost a year in, maybe even 2 years into my healing journey, was that confidence does not equal self worth. And that at the core of all of this wounding was low or no self worth. Because if I believed, truly believed that I was worthy, then what I had experienced would have been unacceptable to me.
To put a boundary in place, to advocate for ourselves, to be empowered to stand, in our bodies and in our opinions and in our values, like that requires that we believe we're worthy of it. How does somebody start to work with that? This is something that comes up. I do a lot of work around worthiness, but I really want to hear from your
Yeah.
perspective and your life
Yeah.
experience. What do you see when it comes to the very first steps to starting to heal that worthiness wound?
Yeah. This is this is so foundational and at the core of everything that I teach is that there is a self-love deficit. So there's a educator and psychologist. His name is Ross Rosenberg, and he created a model called the self-love deficit. Self-love, yeah, SLDD, self-love deficit disorder. And really, it's the flip side of what the codependent programming is all about. And in order to begin to value yourself and truly know that you are whole and complete and absolutely worthy, is to begin to love yourself first. And when we begin to explore self love or the absence of self love, we begin to understand the ways in which we have abandoned ourselves
Mm.
and how we are no longer willing to operate like that anymore. And so, starting to love yourself first, which does not come naturally when you've never done that, That is a practice. And that is, why working with a mentor like Kayla or myself is so important, because you do have to learn how to love yourself,
Mhm.
but being intentional and being proactive with that, starting to instill a daily practice of self love. So, back in the day, Louise Hay created what's
Mhm.
called mirror work. And so, um, looking into the mirror and talking about love and self love and loving thine self first. It's there's so many practices now and so many other modalities that you can use to begin to step into that, but that's the starting point, is recognizing that there has been a self-love deficit, and then choosing to be intentional around beginning a self-love practice,
Mm.
getting in touch with yourself in ways that you would never have considered before. So it's essentially making yourself a primary priority, first, last, and always.
That power around the fact that when self-love hasn't been the norm and you
Mhm.
have this deficit, that it is a practice, it's a commitment, it takes time. You don't just recognize, oh, I haven't really loved myself well. I'm gonna love myself more now and
Yeah.
everything magically changes overnight.
Yeah,
Like
no.
it's so much more complicated than that. You have
Yeah.
to show up regularly to this practice and to yourself. And I think that's so hard for people because they're so, especially women, this feeling of like selfishness and like centering ourselves in our own stories
Yes.
in that way feels uncomfortable for a lot of women. But to make that commitment to yourself and to show up for yourself in love. And I think that's one of the reasons, even just the act of deciding to work with a coach or a mentor or a therapist or whatever your particular life journey requires for support,
Mm-hmm.
just that act of making that commitment to work with someone is such a leap of love because it's
Yeah.
saying, I deserve this help and this support.
Yeah. 100%. You are showing yourself love by choosing yourself and choosing to start taking steps towards a more, I want to say, whole and complete life.
Mm.
When we are not loving ourselves, which is also a way of saying overgiving and people pleasing, we are not really living a whole and complete life. We may think we are, but there is so much more available to us, because what happens when you're living from that codependent programming and conditioning, you are always depleted. You're always giving so much more than you're getting back. You're always going out of your way to help somebody else before you help yourself, so that you're running on empty. You're physically exhausted, you're mentally exhausted, you're emotionally exhausted. And depending on the circumstances, you may be financially exhausted. So you're not living a whole and complete life. When we begin to flip the paradigm, as I call it, and start to put ourselves first, begin on that self love journey, begin making ourselves a priority first, last, and always, we actually end up being able to give even more, because we are giving from overflow rather than giving from depletion or a deficit.
So key, so powerful. And it's that when you realize that, you know that this is the least selfish work you could be doing, right? Like the
That's
world,
right.
the world needs us to be
Yeah.
giving from abundance and overflow and not from lack. Like that's where all of these unhealthy patterns just continue to get perpetuated. We need to be healed ourselves to be able to serve in healing the world as a whole. We all have a part to
Yes.
play in this. So
Yeah.
okay. We've
Yeah.
gone so many amazing places. This is just So beautiful. Okay, so I'm going to let everyone know that thankfully this isn't going to be all that you'll hear of Sara. We're actually going to be doing 3 episodes together. But is there anything else you'd like to share today? Any final thoughts on this topic of toxic relationships? Anywhere we didn't go, or any final pieces of wisdom or advice for the listeners as we wrap up this episode?
Mm, What's coming up for me as I'm listening to you ask that question is, and I think this must be coming up from client conversations that I've had recently and from my experience, is that it is so important to give yourself so much grace.
Mm.
And when we talk about giving ourselves grace, what we're saying is that you don't need to shame and blame yourself any longer for being in whatever situation you are in, and that there is so much more vitality and overflow available to you when you choose to intentionally take that step towards self-love.
Yes. Grace. A beautiful gift that we can all offer ourselves a little more frequently, I think.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, before we say goodbye, this has been amazing. Thank you for everything. I feel like my heart is just so full in this moment. I've been just very, very moved and touched by our conversation and by your experiences and the way that you speak in such real and practical ways. It's so clear that you've lived this and that you are the living example of the other side. Like, I can feel that calming, peaceful presence from you. And I hope that everyone who's listening is able to see that and recognize
Mm.
that that's possible for all of us, no matter what the current situation looks like. So, thank
Yeah.
you for everything you are and everything you've showed us today. I would love for you to share just briefly where people can find you. We'll put some links and things in the show notes, but where can people find you? How can they connect with you if they want to follow you, they want to learn more, or they're interested in working with you?
Mm. So, my business name is Illuminated Joy. So everything is under that name. So you can find me on Instagram at Illuminated Joy, and the website is illuminatedjoy.com. And in the show notes, there will be a gift for the listeners, which is a audio guided meditation. So to begin to experience just a little bit of peace and ease, I've created an audio file for your listeners to be able to just have a moment of relaxation.
Mm. Thank you so much. What a beautiful gift. So, that's something everyone could do right now as you're wrapping up listening. You can click on that and take a moment for yourself, take a moment of self-love. I always encourage you all as we wrap up these conversations, as we continue to have these deep conversations, is to make it real in your lives. So, whatever landed that you heard today, find a way to bring it into your day to day. Start asking yourself these questions, doing these reflections, and integrating self love and awareness into your life and your relationships. And listening to this audio file, this gift from Sara, could be part of that for you. So make sure you check that out. This has been so amazing. Thank you again, Sara, for coming on today.
Thank you, Kayla. This has been a really super profound conversation, and I so appreciate you. Thank you.
Well, we will be back with Sara again, and next time we're going to be talking about boundaries and energetics. So stay tuned for that. It'll be coming soon. And I hope that everybody just takes radically good care of themselves. And I'll talk to you all soon. Bye.
Thank you for listening. If you want more resources on thriving in your life or want details on working with me, check out my website at internallyguidedleadership.com or follow me on Instagram, Facebook, or TikTok at Internally Guided Coach. Be gentle with yourselves out there, and I'll talk to you next time.